Welcome to Nonfiction Book Review Report for How Democracies Die by Stephen. Sorry, by Stephen Levitsky, Daniel Ziblatt. The idea behind my nonfiction book review report is for me to give you the general idea of what the book is about, discuss some of those topics, and give my opinion of the book. Now, let's get on to the authors. The authors are very important to any nonfiction book, because if they're a specialist in the field and they are writing about that field in their book, that kind of raises the standard for my evaluation of the book. If they're not specialists in the field, then I'm not gonna look at the book as detailed. I will be looking at the facts to be as well presented. In this case, both authors are professors in Harvard University, and they both focus on politics. Stephen Levitsky focuses on Latin America and authoritative regimes, while Daniel Ziblatt focuses on Europe from 19th century to the present, again on the politics of Europe. So they both pretty much focus on democracies and how democracies develop or how they go down into authoritative regimes. Let's talk about the book. Now, the first thing it's quite easy to understand, it's quite easy to see actually, is that the book is written as a reaction to the Donald Trump election. You can get that from the beginning, from the introduction of the book, that it's specifically focused around that idea. However, the second section of it is that discusses the issues with democracy as a system of government is actually very interesting. Specifically, I would say that half of the book is devoted to Donald Trump's election, half of it is discusses the system of government that is democracy. And usually it's a case as it goes like this, where one chapter discusses general ideas and problems of democracy, and then second one kind of applies it to Donald Trump, and then so on and so on. So you have kind of a pretty much first, the theory, then attempt for them to apply it in practice to what's going on right now in the US politics. Now, to me, the Donald Trump section was not as interesting, and I'm mostly focused on their ideas and discussion of democracies and how they go from being democracy to authoritative regime. Now, the one way that they discuss and very quickly kick off is that the idea of a coup d'etat where military takes over, or something along those lines. And so they kind of go through that, and they pretty much say that this is not going to be the focus of the book. Now, the focus of the book is the actual change of democracy from the system where it is in actual democracy to a system where the government is basically has a veneer of democracy. The idea is that it looks like there are elections. It looks like you have the parliament and everything working. You have the judiciary system properly doing stuff. It looks like you have executive branch. Everything seems to be working. All those three columns of power are all there. It all seems to be in view of kind of or legally it all seems to be independent, but in reality it's all either controlled by a small elite or by one person who's pulling the shots, and that person is able to control who gets into the government, and so therefore everybody pretty much answers to that person. So it looks like there are elections, but people who could be on the ballot are not the ones that people really might be able to say, might not have popularity or might not be chosen by the people, but rather they are chosen by the actual people right now in power, who say, yeah, well, we're gonna let these guys take, to be representative, to be in the government, because they do not disagree with us. So there's no dissent, there's no opposition in that kind of a democracy, in that kind of country where there's a veneer of democracy, not the actual democracy. So now the book focuses on the main points: how to recognize the person who's coming up, and what to do about that kind of person, how to stop that person from coming up, who take democracy from democracy as it is to the veneer of democracy system. Now, the first thing they talk about is gatekeeping, and the idea in gatekeeping is they demonstrated through history of the United States, and actually they do demonstrate in a few history of other nations, the idea that when you have parties that will not let certain candidates be nominated for any positions in the government or to be even considered for elections because they do not agree with that candidate's position, or they see that candidate as a threat to democracy. And they demonstrate that with regards to US politics, specifically situations where it is the candidates were blocked by both Republican or the Democratic parties. So these people were not even candidates. They had the popular support. In one case, I think they even noted that the statistic was like the person had a 40% support among the Americans, but the party said no, they're not gonna put that person up because they did not like that person. They thought that that person would be in danger to the overall system of democracy that was in the United States. Now, the way they say gatekeeping is done through three different levels. There's a party's leadership that actually selects who's going to be nominated, who's going to be on the ballot, and they can block a person up there. There's also the sponsors, that's the financial people who provide the money to the party, give donations, and they also can say, no, we're not going to support a certain person because we don't agree with that person. And finally, there's also media. Each party has a certain amount of certain representatives in media who support them and endorse the party, and therefore these people in the media might say that we're not gonna give any coverage to certain people, certain members maybe of the party. They think they're dangerous. They should not be put into any position of power. Now the issue with that, of course, that comes out immediately is that you have a situation where as they gave a statistic where you had a popular person who had a 40% approval rating, well, I guess not approval, but support rating type of thing, where they were looking forward to maybe becoming president in the United States. Oh, I forgot it, but the president or some other position in the government, but they had a 40% support of American people, but the party elite was the one that said no. So in other words, you don't really have much of a democracy if the people in power, elite, as the ones who are going to be choosing who's going to be nominated, who's going to be put on the ballot, right? That goes back to the previous point that when you have a veneer of a democracy, not the real democracy, it's not the people who decide going to be the government, it's somebody else who already pre-decided that and put those people in to be just, approved kind of not even approved, but just check mark by the elections or any other process. Make sure that they get in, and it looks like there is actual democracy, right? So in this way, this gatekeeping kind of sounds like the same thing that they criticize at the same point, and that goes to the whole idea where you have the extremes, the full dictatorship versus full democracy. Neither of them is completely possible. There's no such thing as full democracy because that will mean that every single person makes votes on every single decision that the government needs to undertake, and that will mean that there's going to be endless referendums that have to be organized. Costs and all that will be just prohibitive right now, as far as we know. So that isn't impossible. That's why we never ever have a full democracy. We always more of a the system is called the republic, where you have elected representatives of the people who kind of make the decisions on the behalf of the people they represent. Now the other extreme is a full dictatorship, where one person makes every single decision down to all the minor decisions. Again, that's impossible because no single person can actually handle that kind of workload. So there's always some kind of division of responsibilities. So when we go look from there, so from full democracy where it's all people, and where full dictatorship where it's only one person, one that make a decision, we always look for this what's called a Goldilocks zone, I guess, and nobody can really say exactly where it is. Right now, we always believe that it should be closer to the full democracy, but how close or how far a bit back, we don't know, right? And the idea of parties doing gatekeeping, that kind of, I guess, moves it away from full democracy if you have parties doing that towards more of a dictatorship way, because now you have a elite doing more of a choice in the government about who actually participates in the government. Now, let's move on to the next point. The next point is popularity, and this is another one that they talk about. And the idea is that here is that a person who's very popular with the people uses that popularity to push through reforms that will undermine the democracy of the nation. So, any nation that has a democratic government has a system of checks and balances. You have the three branches of government: the executive, legislative, and judicial, and they all kind of balance and check each other. The idea behind the use of popularity is that, let's say, one of those branches have a person who's very popular, they start to push through reforms that undermine the other two, but the other two are too afraid to take action or to use their checks balances that they have, those powers, to stop this, because they're afraid that because the person is so popular that they're gonna suffer in the end, because that person will overwhelm them with their popularity. And they give few examples of that also being used overall in I think mostly it was in the Latin American region that where they talk about that, where mostly it was executive and legislative branch that use the popularity to push through reforms that kind of cut away the powers of the other branches. But at the same time, again, it goes kind of the whole idea of a democracy at the same time to criticize this, because people are supporting this popular person, and if that's what they want, then how is it anti-democratic that this should not be allowed, right? The idea is that people want it, and the democracy is a power by the will of the people. Is supposed to represent the will of the people. If people want that, then it should be happening, right? So this is kind of again that the usual pull and pull that you have between the extremes, and so the idea is that can you rely really? Can the people actually understand what's happening here? Are they actually can understand how this changes will affect the whole system? So this is another PowerPoint that they're discussing here, and again they're talking about being wary of anybody who's using popularity to push for reforms that will undermine the system of government in the country. The next one is they're talking about the powers that the different branches command. You have executive, legislative, and judicial branches. They all have checks and balances, and the argument is that, well, it's actually pretty true that when you study the system of government in school, when you go through that courses in school, and they tell you how all these checks and balances exist there to make sure that one branch is not able to usurp power against the other branches or to abuse power because other branches will stop it. It sounds like a very robust system, but what they do is that they again demonstrate with examples that you can actually use the powers of the checks and balances that all the branches have to abuse it. So in other words, one of your examples is that in many countries that have presidents or prime minister who are similar in a role to the president, they can govern by executive orders or something along those lines, basically, or directives which in a way pretty much surpass and overstep the legislative branch, because they don't need to go through the legislative branch to issue those orders. They can say that do this, and this kind of becomes the law quite often. That's the power they're given, and so legislative branch has no say in it. So them being the elected representatives of the people, they can't weigh in on that. Same thing, the executive branch can change the judiciary by removing judges or by expanding judiciary and stuffing it with people that will be yes-sayers to them, right? And so that way, again, the executive branch have all those powers and they can abuse them. Now, legislative branch can do things to the executive branch as well. They can impeach any president, they can remove presidents, they can remove members of cabinet, they can block anything that the executive branch is trying to do in terms of assigning the judiciary or something like that. They can stall legislations that the executive branch is looking for. In other words, they can really also use their powers that they have to such an extent as to make executive branch or judicial branch incapable of doing anything. The executive branch quite often is able also to remove judges as well. In judicial branch, for this one they have fewer examples than for executive and legislative. I think they mostly focus on executive and legislative branches and their ability to abuse power, but judicial branch also has the ability to strike down legislations quite often, or strike down any orders by executive branch based on the fact that they can deem to be unconstitutional. They also have other powers as well, right? They can go after certain members of in all other branches as well. And so this kind of creates ability for those branches to really push at the other ones, and that way intimidate them or kind of manipulate them. And so it looks like it's all democratic, it's all legal because everybody's acting within the law, because that's what the Constitution and the legislations allow them to do. But in the end, they really pretty much sabotaging the system of government, because now, if all these branches are going to kind of a war against each other, there's nothing's getting done. So the fourth point they have is called unwritten rules, and that kind of supports the whole idea of powers. The unwritten rules here is that they kind of a more not really rules, but something that some kind of customs, so type of ways of doing things that have become solidified because everybody keeps doing that way. So it's not a written down rules, but they call them kind of if they call the powers of the guardrails of democracy, this is like more of a soft guardrails, additional supports that exist there. And so the idea behind unwritten rules, let's say if an executive branch can appoint members of cabinet at will, but they've been for years and years always consulting with the legislative branch about who should be members of the cabinet, that becomes an unwritten rule that as the president you should be consulting with the legislative branch to appoint your cabinet. If somebody breaks that, that's breaking that unwritten rule. The executive branch is able always to appoint judges to the courts, and legislative branch might have ability to stop the appointment, but never actually interferes with that. That's an unwritten rule, another one. So this is kind of the idea is that it's more, as they say, it's pretty much rules that exist there to prevent this major power struggles between branches where they're going to exercise for the checks and balances they have in the Constitution to kind of go to war each other. And so these are kind of written rules. This is what you fall in the way it says, okay, if you have ability to do all this stuff, but you're never gonna go to that extreme. Then you're gonna at one point you're gonna say, I'm gonna stop here because that's where everybody else stopped before you. Every other politician stopped before you. We're not gonna overstep that line, even though we can. Now, the final one is that they talk about is the preservation of the democracy, and of course, the preservation of democracy is being vigilant for all those things. For abuses of power by the branches that they get from the Constitution, the breaking of written rules, or the idea that somebody using popularity to push stuff through, as well as the idea that there is no gatekeeping, so the gatekeeping is eroding, which they say that pretty much has eroded in United States politics, and as far as the others are concerned. So if you have seen that, that's dangerous to the system of democracy that we have currently in place in most of the countries. Also, other things they talk about is the idea such as seeing up your political opponents as enemies, as people who are there to sabotage the nation, to destroy it, and so you kind of pushing that idea constantly that these guys are enemies. So rather than considering them to be people with a different opinion from you, you always see them as enemies. So anything that is your opponent's political opponents suggest, you're gonna say no to, and that's it kind of grinds the whole system of the government to a halt, even if it's a good idea. In other words, they say that quite often different political parties have common grounds. They agree on a lot of things, they just disagree about certain things. But quite often, because of that, they begin to treat each other as enemies. And even if something that should be agreeable to both parties will be said, the other party will be just saying no to it just because it's been given by another party. And the other thing they talk about is resisting things that will cause long-term harm to the country overall, but resisting them will cause you short-term harm. So it's again the idea is that it goes back to gatekeeping or such like that, where the parties or the branches will resist their own kind of a line and step away from it. This goes to the third point as there as well. And they're gonna say, no, we're gonna stop and we're not gonna let this go on. Yes, we will suffer as a result of that right now, but overall the system will stay intact. One of the things they say about that is that they give Nixon as an example where the Republican Party would have supported Nixon to stop the whole impeachment processes and investigations, but rather chose to support the Democratic Party as well, and both of them kind of did a bipartisan type of investigation into Nixon. The idea was that Nixon overstepped that line, and so both parties united in United States politics to stop him. This was the idea that yes, this will cause a short-term harm to Republican Party because Nixon was the Republican president, but overall there's a long-term gain for the whole system overall. So in conclusion, well, first thing first, I'm gonna say this is a very easy to read book, and that's very important because whenever academics usually write books, it's much harder to read them. This was not the case. This was pretty easy to read. This is a very big plus for the book. Second one is that I really love the discussion about democracy and the idea that you can kind of undermine its democracy itself through the use of a constitution and its own legislations. So there isn't when somebody says they're like, oh well, it's all legal. Yes, it might be all legal, but in the end, the final result might be is that the system of government itself is being broken because the legal powers, if interpreting them to the letter law rather than to the spirit of the law, might cause harm. And of course, the problem that I had with the book is how much is actually it focuses on Trump. And that's of course it kind of try to make the book relevant, but to me that means the book's relevance will start to dissipate because eventually Trump is not going to be the president. Eventually people will be reading this book and be like, okay, well, yes, maybe the Trump is this scary person as they see him, that he has potential to destroy the American democracy. But at the same time, if that doesn't happen, the people who will be reading it will be disregarding the book now and its points just because the authors were not were perceiving that the Trump fell into all this category. All right, thank you for listening.